It did not begin with an explosion, not the kind people imagine, not a sudden flash tearing through the sky, but something quieter, something almost ordinary, a sequence of decisions, small adjustments, inside a control room where everything still seemed under control, where instruments still responded, where nothing, at least on the surface, suggested disaster, and yet, beneath that illusion, something had already begun to change. On the night of April 25, 1986, inside reactor number 4 of the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant, operators were preparing for a test, a routine procedure on paper, something that had been delayed, pushed further into the night, into hours when fatigue settles in, when focus becomes fragile and confidence quietly replaces caution. The goal was simple, or at least it seemed simple, to test whether the reactor could still generate power during a shutdown, a technical check, nothing more, nothing that should have carried risk beyond what they already understood, because these were not inexperienced men, they were trained, disciplined, familiar with the system they controlled, and yet, what they were about to do would push that system into a condition it was never meant to hold. The power level dropped, lower than expected, lower than safe, slipping into a range where the reactor became unstable, unpredictable, but not visibly dangerous, not in a way that forced them to stop, not in a way that triggered immediate alarm, and so, instead of shutting everything down, they tried to recover it. Control rods were pulled out, more than regulations allowed, more than should ever be removed, but it was necessary, they believed, to bring the power back, to stabilize the reaction, to continue the test, and for a moment it worked. The power began to rise again, slowly, unevenly, but enough to move forward, enough to convince them that the situation was still manageable. But what they could not see, what no instrument clearly revealed, was that the reactor had already crossed a threshold, a point where its behavior no longer followed predictable rules, where small changes could trigger massive reactions, where stability was no longer real, only temporary, fragile, waiting to collapse. And still the test continued. Safety systems were disabled, not out of negligence but because they interfered with the procedure, automatic shutdown mechanisms turned off, protections removed, step by step, layer by layer, the reactor was left exposed, not physically but operationally, stripped of the safeguards that were meant to contain exactly what was about to happen. And then, at 1:23 a.m., everything changed. The final stage of the test began, the moment that was supposed to prove control, to confirm stability, to demonstrate safety, and instead, it triggered the exact opposite, because when the operators pressed the shutdown button, inserting the control rods back into the core, something unexpected happened, something no one in that room fully understood in that moment. A sudden surge. Power did not decrease, it spiked, violently, uncontrollably, rising faster than any system could respond, faster than any human could react, because the design of the reactor carried a flaw, hidden, overlooked, a flaw that caused the control rods to increase reactivity for a brief but critical moment, and in a stable reactor that would mean nothing, but here, in this unstable state, it meant everything. The power level exploded, not gradually, not in stages, but all at once, surging to hundreds of times its normal output in seconds, less than seconds, a runaway reaction, unstoppable, irreversible. And then, the first explosion. A force powerful enough to tear through the reactor, lifting the massive concrete lid, breaking the structure apart, exposing the core, opening something that was never meant to be seen, and seconds later, a second explosion followed, more violent, more destructive, scattering burning graphite into the night, throwing radioactive material across the facility, igniting fires on the roof, on nearby buildings, across a space that, just moments before, had been under control. But the most dangerous part could not be seen. Radiation, invisible, silent, already spreading into the air, rising above the plant, carried by the wind, moving outward toward the sleeping city of Pripyat, where thousands of people remained unaware, still inside their homes, still living their normal lives, not knowing that the air itself had changed, that something deadly had already reached them. Inside the control room, confusion replaced certainty, instruments failed, readings contradicted each other, some showed nothing, others showed impossible values, numbers that made no sense, and the operators, trying to understand what they were seeing, could not yet accept the truth, because what had just happened was not supposed to be possible. A reactor could not explode like that. It wasn't designed to. It wasn't meant to. And so, they searched for explanations that fit within what they believed, assuming the core was still intact, assuming the damage was limited, assuming the situation, while serious, was still controllable. But outside, reality told a different story. On the roof, fragments of the reactor itself lay scattered, burning, glowing in the darkness, pieces of graphite emitting radiation so intense that standing near them for minutes was enough to cause irreversible damage. And still, the firefighters arrived. They did not hesitate. They climbed onto those roofs, stepped over those fragments, moved toward the flames with hoses in hand, doing exactly what they had been trained to do, extinguish the fire, contain the damage, protect what could still be saved, unaware that the real danger was not the fire, but the invisible force surrounding it, penetrating their bodies, damaging them from within, silently, without warning. And still they continued. Because stopping was not an option. Because no one had told them. Because no one fully understood yet what they were facing. As the night stretched on, the scale of the disaster began to reveal itself slowly, not all at once, through fragments, through reports that did not align, through observations that raised more questions than answers. Because the reactor was gone, the core was exposed, and the environment around it was changing in ways that could no longer be ignored. But even then, the full truth remained just out of reach. Hidden behind disbelief, behind assumptions, behind the simple human refusal to accept that something this catastrophic could have already happened. And in Pripyat, life continued. Lights stayed on, people slept, children dreamed, unaware that by morning, everything would be different, that the world they knew had already begun to disappear. Because what had started inside that reactor was no longer contained. It was spreading. Moving beyond the plant, beyond control, beyond anything they could stop, becoming something far larger, far more dangerous, and far more difficult to understand. And as the first light of dawn slowly approached, revealing the damage in clearer detail, one question remained, heavier than anything else. Not whether something had gone wrong, but how far it had already gone. Morning arrived quietly. Too quietly. The city of Pripyat woke up like any other day, with no alarms, no announcements, no warnings, only the ordinary rhythm of life continuing as if nothing had changed. Children prepared for school, workers got ready for their shifts, and families opened their windows to let in the cool morning air, unaware that what entered their homes was no longer safe. There was no panic because there was no information. Inside the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant, the reality was impossible to ignore. The reactor was destroyed, the core exposed, and radiation levels had risen beyond anything the instruments were designed to measure accurately. Some devices showed normal readings only because they had reached their limits, while others displayed impossible numbers that were dismissed at first, simply because they could not be true. Workers moved through the facility trying to understand the damage, stepping into areas where exposure levels were already deadly, often without proper protection, often without knowing that every minute carried consequences that could not be reversed. The firefighters who had responded during the night began to feel the first effects. At first, it was subtle, a metallic taste in the mouth, a strange heat on the skin, then nausea, dizziness, and a growing weakness that could not be explained by exhaustion alone. They had fought the fire and done their job, but what they had been exposed to was not something they could fight. They were taken to hospitals, still unaware of the true cause, while doctors, equally unprepared, tried to treat symptoms they did not yet fully understand. Meanwhile, in Pripyat, something began to feel wrong. Not suddenly, not in a way that caused immediate fear, but in small, unsettling details. A strange smell in the air, a taste that lingered, dust settling where it should not have been. Children played outside, unknowingly breathing in radioactive particles and carrying them back into their homes. And still no official warning came. Hours passed, then more hours. Nearly an entire day. The delay was not accidental, it was hesitation, uncertainty, and the weight of a system that required confirmation before action, even when time had already become the most critical factor. By the afternoon, radiation levels outside the plant could no longer be ignored. Measurements showed that contamination was spreading beyond the facility, carried by the wind into surrounding areas. And still the city remained. It was not until nearly 36 hours after the explosion that the decision was finally made. Evacuation. Even then, it was presented carefully, not as a disaster but as a temporary measure. Buses began to arrive, lining the streets, engines running, waiting. Residents were told to take only essential belongings, documents, basic items, nothing more, and that they would return in a few days. And so, they believed it. Families left their homes as they were, meals still on tables, personal belongings untouched, toys left behind, pets waiting at doors that would never open again. The evacuation moved in an orderly way, no panic, no chaos, just lines of people boarding buses, looking back briefly, expecting to return. But they would not. Because the contamination had already spread beyond the city, into the soil, into the trees, into everything around it. The land itself had changed. And beyond Pripyat, radiation continued to move, carried by the wind across regions and borders, invisible and undetected at first, until monitoring stations in other countries began to register something unusual. Something that could not be explained by local sources. This was not a contained incident. Back at the plant, efforts to control the disaster intensified. Helicopters flew over the exposed reactor, dropping sand and other materials in an attempt to reduce the release of radioactive particles. Each flight carried risk, each pass exposed crews to dangerous levels of radiation, but they continued because there was no alternative. On the ground, workers and soldiers began to arrive. Some understood the danger, many did not. They were given tasks and they carried them out, clearing debris, measuring radiation, trying to stabilize what remained. Inside hospitals, the condition of the first responders worsened. Burns appeared without fire, internal damage progressed rapidly, and doctors began to realize that this was something far more serious than they had first believed. This was radiation sickness. And it was already too late for some of them. Because what had happened that night did not end with the explosion. It continued in the air, in the ground, and in the bodies of those who had been closest. And as more information slowly emerged, as the scale of the disaster became clearer, the question that had formed at dawn only grew heavier. Not just how far it had gone, but how much damage had already been done before anyone even realized there was something to stop. And as that realization began to spread, not just through reports and measurements, but through the visible decline of those who had been closest to the reactor, the disaster entered a new phase, one that could no longer be hidden behind uncertainty or delay, because the consequences were no longer theoretical, they were human, immediate, and impossible to ignore. Inside the hospitals, the first responders who had stood on the roof of the reactor building, who had walked across burning graphite without knowing what it was, began to deteriorate in ways that doctors had rarely seen. At first, it looked like severe exhaustion, then like chemical poisoning, but soon it became clear that something far more destructive was happening inside their bodies. Their skin reddened, then darkened, burns forming without fire, as radiation damaged tissue from within, breaking down cells faster than the body could repair them. Some of them remained conscious, speaking, asking questions, unaware of how quickly their condition was worsening, while others began to lose strength, their immune systems collapsing, leaving them vulnerable to infections their bodies could no longer fight. It was not a sudden death. It was a process. Slow, painful, and irreversible. Doctors worked without full protection, without complete understanding, trying everything they could, treating symptoms rather than causes, because the cause itself could not be removed. Radiation, once absorbed, does not leave easily. It remains, continuing its damage long after exposure has ended. And while inside the hospitals the first visible victims struggled to survive, outside, a different kind of response was beginning to take shape. The Soviet authorities, now fully aware that the situation was far more serious than initially believed, began mobilizing resources on a scale rarely seen outside of wartime. Engineers, scientists, soldiers, and workers were brought in, thousands of them, tasked with containing something that could not be contained in any conventional way. They would later be known as the liquidators. Their mission was simple in description, but nearly impossible in reality. Contain the reactor. Prevent further spread. Reduce radiation levels. Stabilize what remained. But every step came with risk. One of the first priorities was the fire inside the reactor. Even after the explosions, the core continued to burn, releasing radioactive material into the atmosphere. Helicopters flew over the open reactor, dropping sand, lead, clay, and boron in an attempt to smother the fire and absorb neutrons, reducing the reaction inside. From a distance it looked controlled, organized. But inside those helicopters the reality was different. Pilots flew directly above the exposed core, into radiation levels that could cause severe damage within minutes. Instruments often failed, readings unreliable, and yet they continued, making pass after pass, knowing the risk because the alternative was worse. On the ground, another threat emerged. Beneath the reactor, water had accumulated, and if the molten core material, now burning at extreme temperatures, reached it, the result could have been a massive steam explosion, far more destructive than what had already occurred, potentially spreading contamination across a much larger region. And so, a decision was made. The water had to be drained. But accessing it required entering areas with extremely high radiation levels, spaces where exposure time had to be measured in minutes, sometimes seconds. Volunteers were sent in, moving through dark, flooded corridors, relying on memory, maps, and fading light, searching for valves that would release the water. They knew the risk. They went anyway, because failure was not an option. At the same time, efforts began to remove the most dangerous debris from the roof of the reactor building. Fragments of graphite, pieces of fuel, materials emitting lethal radiation, scattered across surfaces where they could not remain. Machines were sent in first. Robots. But the radiation interfered with their electronics, causing them to fail, to stop working, to become useless in the very environment they were meant to operate in. And so, the task fell to humans. Men were sent onto the roof in short shifts, sometimes no more than 60 to 90 seconds, given basic protective gear, instructed to move quickly, to shovel debris, to throw it back into the reactor, to clear as much as possible before their time ran out. Each second mattered. Each movement carried exposure. And yet, they returned again and again, replacing each other, continuing the work that machines could not do. Because the situation demanded it. Because delay meant more contamination, more spread, more risk. And while all of this was happening at the plant, beyond its borders, the impact continued to expand. Radiation clouds moved across Europe, detected first not by those closest to the source, but by monitoring stations in other countries, where rising radiation levels triggered alarms that could not be ignored. Questions were asked. Explanations demanded. And slowly, information began to emerge, not all at once, not completely, but enough to confirm that something significant had happened, something that could no longer be contained within one region or one narrative. Back in the evacuation zone, Pripyat stood empty, silent, abandoned. A city designed for life, now frozen in the moment it had been left behind. Apartments still held personal belongings, schools still contained books and desks, streets remained lined with structures that no longer served their purpose. Time had stopped there. But outside, time continued. And with it, the long-term consequences began to take shape. Exposure did not end when people left the city. It followed them, in their bodies, in the particles they had inhaled, in the contamination they carried without knowing. And for those who had worked closest to the reactor, the outcome was already becoming clear. Some would not survive. Others would live, but not without cost. And as the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the disaster began to shift from an immediate crisis into something deeper, something longer, something that would not end with containment or cleanup. Because what had been released that night was not just energy. It was something that would remain. In the environment, in the land, in the lives of those who had been touched by it. And as the efforts to control the reactor continued, as more people were brought in, as more actions were taken, one reality became impossible to avoid. This was not a problem that could be solved quickly. Not something that could be reversed. Only something that could be managed, at a cost that was still not fully understood. And as that reality settled in, not just among those working at the reactor but across the entire system that had been forced to respond, the disaster entered a phase where urgency began to collide with long-term consequences, because it was no longer only about stopping what was happening in that moment, but about preventing what could happen next. The fire inside the reactor was gradually brought under control, but the core itself remained exposed, unstable, and dangerous, continuing to release radiation into the environment. It was clear that something more permanent had to be done, something that would isolate what remained and reduce the ongoing contamination. And so, a new objective was set. Build a barrier. Not a perfect solution, not a final answer, but a structure that could contain the damaged reactor, sealing it off from the outside world as much as possible. This would later become known as the sarcophagus, a massive construction built under extreme conditions, where time, radiation, and uncertainty all worked against those involved. Thousands of workers were brought in for this task. Engineers, construction crews, soldiers, all operating under strict time limits, because the radiation levels around the reactor made prolonged exposure impossible. Work was divided into short shifts, carefully calculated to reduce risk. But even then, every moment spent near the core added to a cumulative dose that could not be undone. The construction itself was unlike anything they had done before. Measurements were difficult, visibility was limited, and much of the work had to be improvised, adjusted in real time as conditions changed. Materials were transported, assembled, and positioned with speed and precision, because delays were not an option. At the same time, decontamination efforts spread across the surrounding region. Entire villages were evacuated, not just those closest to the reactor, but those within a growing exclusion zone, areas where radiation levels made long-term habitation unsafe. Houses were abandoned, fields left untouched, and in some cases, entire structures were buried to prevent the spread of contamination. Forests were cut down. Soil was removed. Roads were washed repeatedly in an attempt to reduce radioactive particles, though it was never fully possible to eliminate them. The contamination was not something that could simply be cleaned away, it had bonded with the environment itself, becoming part of it. And yet, life did not disappear entirely. In the absence of people, nature began to return. Slowly at first, then more noticeably, animals moved back into the area, adapting to conditions that would have been considered uninhabitable for humans. It was a strange contrast, a place marked by disaster, yet showing signs of renewal in ways that no one had expected. Beyond the exclusion zone, the effects continued to unfold in more subtle ways. Agricultural products were monitored, restrictions were placed on food distribution, and certain regions faced long-term limitations due to contamination that could not be seen but had to be accounted for. The disaster had extended far beyond the plant itself. It had become environmental and human. For those who had been relocated, the impact was not only physical but psychological. Entire communities had been displaced, lives interrupted, identities tied to places that no longer existed in the same way. They had left with the expectation of return, but that return never came. And over time that realization settled in. The homes they had built, the lives they had known were gone, not destroyed in a visible sense, but made inaccessible, permanently altered by something they could not fight or even fully understand. Meanwhile, at the reactor site, the construction of the sarcophagus continued under intense pressure. The goal was not perfection but speed, to enclose the damaged unit before further structural collapse could occur, before additional material could be released. Every step required coordination. Every action carried risk. And still progress was made. By late 1986, the structure was completed, enclosing reactor number 4 within a massive concrete and steel shell. It was a significant achievement, but it was not a permanent solution. It was built quickly, under conditions that did not allow for long-term precision, meaning that over time, it would require maintenance, reinforcement, and eventually replacement. But for that moment it served its purpose. It reduced the immediate danger. It stabilized the situation. And it marked the transition from emergency response to long-term management. Because what remained could not simply be removed. It had to be contained. And even then only partially. As the months passed, the intensity of the crisis began to fade from immediate attention, but its effects did not disappear. They continued in quieter ways, through ongoing monitoring, through medical observation, through environmental studies that sought to understand what had changed and what would remain changed for years, even decades. The disaster had moved beyond a single event. It had become a lasting presence. One that could not be undone, only observed, managed, and remembered. And as the world began to process what had happened, to analyze it, to learn from it, another realization began to emerge, one that extended beyond the technical failures and immediate consequences. This had not been only an accident. It had been a combination of design flaws, human decisions, systemic pressures, and delayed responses, all aligning in a way that allowed a manageable situation to become catastrophic. And that meant something important. It meant that it could have been prevented. At least in part. But that realization came too late for those who had already been affected, too late to change what had already happened, too late to reverse the damage that had been set in motion in those early hours of April 26th. Because by the time the full picture became clear, the disaster was no longer something that could be stopped. Only something that could be lived with. And as the disaster shifted from something immediate into something that would last far beyond the moment it began, the final phase was not marked by explosions or fire, but by understanding, slow, incomplete, and often uncomfortable, because what remained was not just damage, but questions that could not be easily answered. In the years that followed, the area around the reactor became known as the exclusion zone, a place defined not by borders on a map, but by levels of contamination, by invisible measurements that determined where it was safe to stand and where it was not. It was a space where human presence had been removed, but the consequences of human action remained. The city of Pripyat stood as a reminder of that moment. Buildings slowly decayed, structures weakened, and nature moved through empty streets, reclaiming what had been left behind. Schools, hospitals, and apartments remained frozen in time, not destroyed in a single event, but gradually transformed by years of abandonment. It was not completely silent. Wind moved through broken windows, metal shifted, and trees grew where they were never meant to. But there were no people, and that absence carried its own weight, because every object left behind told part of a story that had been interrupted, lives that had not ended in that moment, but had been redirected and permanently changed. For those who had lived there, the disaster did not end with evacuation. It followed them in the form of health concerns, uncertainty, and long-term effects that could not always be measured or predicted. Some would experience illness years later, conditions linked to radiation, while others would live without clear answers, never fully knowing how much they had been affected. The same was true for those who had worked at the reactor. The liquidators, thousands of them, each contributing to containment efforts, but at a cost that varied from person to person. Some received high doses in short periods, others lower doses over longer times, but all became part of a response that required human effort in an environment that was never meant for it. As more data was collected over the years, the scale of the disaster became clearer in some ways and more uncertain in others. Radiation spread had been mapped, environmental impact measured, and health effects studied, but no single number could fully define the outcome, because it was not only about immediate casualties, it was about long-term exposure, risk, and probabilities rather than certainties. At the site of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, the original sarcophagus began to show signs of aging over time. Cracks formed, structural weaknesses appeared, and it became clear that a more durable solution would be needed, something capable of containing the reactor safely for decades. Years later, a new structure was built, larger and stronger, designed to cover the original enclosure and provide a higher level of protection, not just for the present but for the future. It was a reminder that the disaster was not confined to the past, but required ongoing attention and responsibility. Because what had been released in 1986 did not simply disappear. It remained in the environment, in restricted areas of land, and in the awareness of what had happened. The disaster became more than an event. It became a lesson, studied and remembered not only for what went wrong but for what it revealed about systems, decisions, and the limits of control. It showed how a series of small choices could combine into something far larger, how delays and assumptions could allow a situation to escalate, and how once a certain threshold is crossed, consequences no longer remain immediate, but unfold over time. Even now, decades later, the story is not entirely finished. The zone still exists, monitoring continues and restrictions remain. While much has been learned, not everything has been fully understood, and not every question has a complete answer. Because understanding what happened is not the same as fully understanding why it happened the way it did, and that distinction matters. The night of April 26, 1986 did not end when the explosion stopped. It continued in consequences, in memory, and in the quiet presence of a place that still stands as evidence of what can happen when control is lost, even for a moment. And perhaps that is what makes this story different, not just the scale of the disaster but the way it continues, not as a single moment in the past, but as something that still exists in what it left behind.